All right. Um, I want to start off by saying happy birthday to my wife Jessie. If you know Jessie, please wish her a happy birthday. She's amazing, and and this is how I celebrate her, by coming up here and locking myself in this room so she can take care of the kids. Uh, but anyway, today's program, just like yesterday, is a little bit different from the regular Friday morning uh, lectures. This one in particular probably a little bit shorter than the others. I do want to again preface that bird ID is not my like strongest point. I know a few things, but really there are some amazing sources out there for bird ID, some amazing field guides, some amazing apps, and um, uh, that are really good at this. So, I will talk a little bit about the ID. I guess I'll be talking more about the ID issues and the birds that are tougher, rather than like the individual seventh year gull plumage uh, that just kind of drives everybody nuts. So I'll be focusing a little bit more on just pointing out the birds that you should take a little more time to identify, uh, and that kind of gives us all headaches. Um, so I do want to start off with a couple of little public service announcements. Um, this talk is about misidentifying birds, um, but I want it to be well known that making mistakes is a huge part of birding. It's a huge part of the learning process. So make mistakes. You will, I will, we all do. Make them big, make them bold, learn from them. Every mistake is a learning opportunity that makes you a better birder. And if you know, more power to you if you can get 25 people to look at a bird that's not the bird that you thought it was. But again, it happens to all of us. So um, again, we're focusing on these kind of commonly misidentified birds, uh, but go out and make the mistakes on your own. Just don't just don't judge people by their mistakes. Except me, you can judge me. Um, Another very important public service announcement that I wish I would have included in yesterday's talk is just a plea to not try to lure birds in so that you can see them better by playing their song. So we all have access to bird songs and speakers. And if there's a bird that's hiding and you want to get a good look at it, if you play their song to them from your device, you likely will get them to come. But it's unethical and it's immoral in my opinion, and does cause there's strong evidence that it causes real physiological harm to the bird. So there are arguments to be made to use playback for research. Um, I, there's even a stretch argument to be made that somebody who can pay a lot of money to see a bird, and then that money that they pay actually goes to help the bird. Again, there's some kind of gray areas, uh, but but I strongly discourage using playback to get a bird. Playback is good to help you identify the birds, and if you can play it at a really low volume to yourself, or if you have headphones or something like that, that could help. But I just really discourage that. All right. So starting with one of the birds that was also in the top 10 most common backyard birds, the fun and familiar Downy Woodpecker. They're common in cities and backyards and in parks. But the hairy woodpecker, which is the same genus, is slightly less common, but still can easily be found in your neighborhood. And of course, in a perfect world, you get views like this, where the two are just hanging out with each other, and you can look for differences such as size. But size is a really hard field mark to look at when you're in the field, because usually you have little to compare it with, and varying distances can make size a really difficult field mark. Um, so then with woodpeckers, like the hairy woodpecker, which is on the left, and the downy woodpecker on the right, which again are pretty easy to tell apart in this photo. You can look for other things on this bird. Again, song. They have very different songs. The downy woodpecker has kind of a descending whinny, and the hairy woodpecker has kind of a stronger, like chat, 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 chat. Kind of sounds like a squirrel sometimes. And if you look also at the relationship of the width of the bill, or the length of the bill, to the length of the head, the downy woodpecker on the left the bill is about the same size as the head is from back to front. And on the downy woodpecker, the bill is about half the size as it is from the back to the front. So if you see enough of these, then you just start to, like I was talking about yesterday, you start to recognize the bird itself for what it is. And then size can help a little bit. But when you're first birding, these can be two pretty difficult ones. Their call, their peat note can be distinguished. The hairies is a little bit hoarser than the downies, which has a little bit more of a pure tone. But don't worry about that, for maybe the first few years that you're doing this. Definitely try it. There was one bird walk when we had one downy and one hairy. They were taking turns, and it was just this beautiful comparison of the two, but they can be pretty hard to tell apart too. The other fun thing to listen for is the cadence of their drumming. And so there's a difference between drumming in woodpeckers and when they actually just bang their head on a tree trying to dislodge an insect. When they're feeding, it's a lot quieter. It just sounds like somebody's kind of pecking at the wood quietly, and then every once in a while a piece of wood flies off. But in that moment, that woodpecker is actually not trying to make noise. It's not trying to attract predators. It's trying to get food. But you can hear that. Drumming is when the drumming is a function of a song. It's talking to other males, letting them know where they are. It's attracting females, and they'll usually find a tree that's maybe got a hollowed out part, or they'll find a telephone pole, something that has really good resonance. And when they drum, they want that to carry. They want to be heard when they're drumming, and so they're looking for that to be a loud drum. And for some woodpeckers, it's very easy to tell their drumming pattern. We don't have a lot of those here. It kind of gets confusing when you add red-bellied woodpeckers and pileated woodpeckers, which can have a really, really deep resonance. But if you hear the downy and the hairy woodpecker, the downy's drumming is slower. You'd think it'd be faster because it's a smaller bird, but it's actually slower. And the way I describe it is that it's almost slow enough for you to count the number of pecks when it's drumming. It's like you think you can almost do it. You really can't, but you can almost think that you're gonna do it. It's that slow. It's that fast, but it's just a little bit slower. But then when you hear a hairy woodpecker drumming, it's too fast to even try to count the individual drums. So that's another little tip to listen for. And then often one of the easiest field marks between these two birds, and if you get a close enough view, you can actually see it on the picture that's up here now. But I'll show you a couple more pictures to see it a little bit better. So here is the tail of a downy woodpecker, and you can kind of see these little black dots kind of in a ladder pattern. And so if you look at the other picture, the original picture, you can just barely see those black dots on the inner part of that tail. And then if you look at the hairy tail, you don't have those black dots. The outer white feathers are just pure white. of course, to complicate it, there's a very small percentage of downy woodpeckers that really don't show those black, but most of them do. And if you see the black dots, you know it's a downy. If you don't see them, it's likely a hairy, but you know you want to verify with some of the other field marks.
Tim, we have a question.
Yep.
What woodpecker makes the delightful soft trill?
Oh, that's probably the red-bellied woodpecker. I'm guessing.
Okay.
Kind of a well, that sounds like a pigeon, but similar to that, I think, is what you're talking about. So that's my guess. Yeah, that is a great way to describe that. You should, whoever did that, you should be a field guide author. Delightful.
Can you say it again? I was the one who asked the question. I didn't hear your answer.
Oh, it's a red-bellied woodpecker. I'm pretty sure that's what you're talking about.
Red belly?
Yeah, red-bellied woodpecker.
Okay.
So excellent question. All right, you'll see. Well, we'll move on to the next one here. All right. Oh, one other thing I want to say with all of these birds, if you see it and you are entering it into eBird, if you're writing it in your journal, you know, write whatever you want. You can say like, I'm pretty sure it's this, I'm pretty sure it's that. But if you're writing something into eBird and you're just not sure, it could have been a downy, it could have been a hairy, there is an entry for a downy or a hairy woodpecker. So you're telling eBird that it was one of the two, you just didn't have enough information to call it one or the other. And that is, you know, that is still helpful to them. So it's important to, if you're in doubt, go to the biggest grouping you can. And there are some very big groupings on eBird, even one, I think, for passerine birds, like perching birds. So, which would include just about everything. Okay, the next grouping of difficult birds are Cooper's hawk versus Sharpshinned hawks. And this is one that I think for downies and hairies, personally, I've got them down pretty well. But for the Coopers and Sharpshinned hawks, I often will just have to go to that larger grouping. Sometimes it's easy because we know that there's Cooper's hawks nesting in Washington Park and Riverside Park, and time of year for these birds actually is important. There's if you see a bird that's nesting in the city, it's almost certainly a Cooper's hawk. Sharpshinned hawks only visit during fall, winter, spring, and they're much less common in the city. So again, knowing how common the birds are is half the battle and when they should be here. So if it's in the summer, it's almost certainly a Cooper's hawk. If it's another time of year, it's still likely a Cooper's hawk, but it could be a Sharpshinned hawk. But when you actually see them and you have a little bit of doubt, these can be one of the most difficult birds to tell apart. If you start with size, a Cooper's hawk, a female Cooper's hawk is about the size of a crow. A female Sharpshinned hawk is about the size of a blue jay. The problem is that a male Cooper's hawk is about the same size as a female Sharpshinned hawk. And apart from behavior, you can't really tell. They're monomorphic in other respects in terms of like their plumage. So size is one of the ways that they're dimorphic, but that's about it. And if you do get a good look at a Cooper's hawk or one of these, they're one of the accipiter hawks. There are a couple things that you can look for if you have a decent look. The first one is that the bird on the left is a Sharpshinned hawk, and these are not to scale, by the way. These are just two separate pictures comparing. But the Sharpshinned hawk, that gray on the head goes all the way back down the neck to the back. Kind of like I think of like a knight with their chain mail armor that kind of goes back to protect the back of their neck. The Coopers, and this isn't the best picture for it, but the Coopers has a very, that gray kind of stops right at the top. It makes it more of a cap. Cap starts with key C, Coopers starts with key C, C, and K, the K sound. And so Coopers have caps. So if you see the gray kind of stop at the head and you get a good look, that's a good field mark for Coopers versus a Sharpshinned hawk. The other one that they say is good and I've never had an easy time using is if you look at the Cooper's hawk on the right, they say they have a kind of a rounded off tail, which I do see sometimes in pictures, but I can tell you, I've seen plenty of Cooper's hawks that have squared off tails like the Sharpshinned on the left, and vice versa. So if they're sitting just right and their tail feathers are just right, it's a clue, but I would never use that to positively ID one or the other. So, and then of course, these are two adult birds. If you look at juvenile birds, it's a different story, maybe a little bit easier because the Cooper's hawks have much finer streaks on them. So the Cooper's hawk here is on the left, and the Sharpshinned hawk has a little thicker, wider streaks on the belly. So that can help, and true to its form, this Cooper's hawk on the left does have that kind of rounded off tail. And then another, if they're not perched and they're just flying in the air, and again, this is a general pattern. The Sharpshinned hawks, when they're soaring, tend to bring the tips of their wings farther forward, so they're more in line with their head. It's like their head is kind of scrunched back a little bit, and that's the Sharpshinned on the left. And here, of course, is a really good size example. The Cooper's hawk on the right, the leading edge of their wings is a little straighter, so it's like the head sticks out a little bit more. If they're kind of in their soaring mode, you can kind of see this, but then sometimes a Cooper's will bring its wing in for aerodynamic reasons or for something else, and it'll look like it's flying a little bit more like a Sharpshinned hawk. There are other things to tell, you know, the flap flap glide pattern and some other things, but these are really difficult birds because remember, you're not going to see these pictures as well as they are. You're going to see them either backlit or behind some trees, or you know, it's not going to be the best views usually. So this is a bird that, you know, more often I will just have to say it's one of the two. You know, and again, if you start to really know an area, like I was talking about, really knowing your backyard or a local park, and you start to see patterns like this, then it starts to, again, make these a little more easy. Like, you know that there's a bird on a nest, or a bird just flew out of a nest, and it's a Cooper's hawk nesting there. And so you start to get to know those patterns through practice.
We have a question.
Sure.
Are the eyes different colors on the adults?
Yes. Good question. And so, you know, if you look back here, oops, so they're yellow. They start yellow and then they get red. So this bird on the right is likely, you know, kind of at the end of its juvenile stage, and they don't go at the same time as their plumage, so you get these kind of transitional periods. But yes, excellent questions. Like a lot of birds, I should say there are several examples of birds where their eyes change color as they age. And maybe the most familiar is the red-eyed vireo, which starts off life as a brown-eyed vireo. So good question. All right, now the next group of birds, which is just a fabulous group of birds. They're called Catharis thrushes, meaning they're all in the same genus, which is Catharis. And they can be one of the more difficult birds to identify, particularly when you're first starting out. We'll start in the upper left. We have what's the gray-cheeked thrush. And don't let the fact that the gray-cheeked thrush is really the only bird showing gray here. A lot of this has to do with lighting. we band birds, and sometimes you'll have a gray-cheeked thrush and a Swainson's thrush, which is, doesn't have gray in its name, but they both look almost exactly the same because the Swainson's thrush is looking a little grayer. So the other thing that you really want to look at immediately is the pattern of the dots on the front. And I would not suggest starting there because that can be difficult. Unless you're talking about the veery, which is on the lower left, which does tend to have much more muted, or the wood thrush, where which is in the center, which does tend to have much brighter spots through its whole body. But don't go to those spots first, because I think that's the first thing we want to do. So the gray cheek thrush in the upper left, and then on the upper right is the Swainson's thrush. And again, the best way to tell the difference between those two is the Swainson's thrush on the right has that little, they're called kind of spectacles, right in front of the eye. There's that creamy patch between the eye and the bill. And it's usually kind of that creamy color. Sometimes it's a little grayer, but you don't see that on the gray cheek thrush. So if you get a good look at the bird, and you can narrow it down between gray cheek and Swainson, you're looking for that little tuft, that creamy colored tuft in front of the eye above the bill, is the best thing to look for. Then if we go to the bottom right, it's a hermit thrush, and the best distinguishing feature of the hermit thrush is that rusty patch on the upper part of the tail. And often that's a bird that will kind of pump that tail and hold it up in that position. But again, those are not always happening all the time, and sometimes the other birds will pump their tail a little bit. And so, but if you can see the contrast between the red on the upper part of the tail versus like the color that you can see on its shoulders, that's a good indication of a hermit thrush. The bottom left bird is the veery. It's probably one of the least common birds here. We don't see them as often as the others, and I feel like they kind of come through more quickly. But they just tend to be washed out and reddish all over, but they still have that thrush look to them. So if you're kind of looking for that general size and shape and recognizing what a thrush looks like, which, robins and bluebirds are also thrushes. They're just in a different genus. I can't remember what genus the robin is in, but maybe Tori will remind us. And then if the bird in the middle is the wood thrush, and it's the biggest of the birds, but it's only about a 1/4 inch longer than the others, and maybe an inch longer than the hermit thrush, which is the smallest. So size can be pretty difficult, but when you see a wood thrush, often it's the bold pattern, and because it's the biggest one, it really kind of like says, "Hey, I'm here," kind of just lets you know, like, I'm a wood thrush, I'm bold, I'm in your face, versus the others that tend to be a little bit more, muted and slinky and I don't know, less in your face. There are other, obviously, song is one of the best ways to tell these apart, and unfortunately we don't get to hear these birds sing in this area hardly at all, because most of them are migrating through and going north. But wood thrushes you can sometimes hear around here. Veeries, you don't have to get too far out of the city to hear veeries sometimes. And I think for the others, you have to go a little bit farther north. Maybe not so much for the hermit thrush either. But anyway, unfortunately here in the city, we don't get to hear them sing as much as I would like to, because they have the most beautiful haunting song. So these are the Catharis thrushes. All right, now we get to an easy one, right? Herring gull versus ring-billed gull. The herring gull it looks like it's twice as big as the ring-billed gull. So if you see them both together on the ground, it's pretty easy to tell the herring gull versus the ring-billed gull by size. But if you see one on its own, it can be a lot harder. And if you see one flying, it can be even a lot harder to really look at size as an indicator. There are people that say they can tell these two apart when they're flying by other patterns, and some people say that they can tell them apart by their voice. I don't really believe any of those groups. I just think they're birders that we trust, so we just believe them when they say what it is. But I really don't think they know how to do that. My personal opinion. If you see an adult of either species, then yeah, and they're on the ground and you get a good look, yeah, it's easy to tell them apart. An adult herring gull has the pinkish legs and that red spot on the bill. And to Robin Squire's point about Nico Tinbergen and a lot of his experiments were looking at what is the purpose of that red dot. And a lot of those experiments have to do with a young gull innately will peck at the red spot on the bill to get their food. So you can trick a young gull into pecking at something that just looks like that. Anything with a pattern, you could put a pencil with a red eraser kind of looks like that, and you can get them to peck at that more than they would at a pencil without an eraser. So it's that red dot that they really kind of hone in on, and obviously, well, very likely the same is the case with the ring-billed gull. And in this bird, you can see that nice black ring around the bill, and then the other characteristic of the ring-billed gull are those yellow legs. And I just remember that because there's two L's next to each other in yellow, and there's two L's next to each other in billed for ring-billed. So that's how I personally remember yellow for ring-billed and pink for herring in terms of the legs. So yeah, this is a super easy bird to identify until you get here. So here we have a herring gull on the left and a ring-billed gull on the right. Just kidding. Those are actually two herring gulls. So gulls themselves, you have second year, third year patterns. If you listen to John Feist's 10 stages of bird watching addiction, the last stage, the 10th stage is that you're addicted, is if you actually try to identify gulls in their first year, second year, third year patterns. They're extremely difficult. Luckily for us, we really only have two on a regular basis. If you go down to the lakefront, you can get some more. Sometimes if you go to the landfill, you'll get some other birds in there. But for the most part, through most of the year, we're looking at these two gulls. But so yeah, these are both herring gulls, and then we'll throw in an immature ring-bill gull because yeah, they have yellow legs. Just kidding. Yeah, so gulls can be really tough. Usually you can see a little bit of a yellowish or pinkish tint in the juvenile stages. And again, people that are better than me will we'll talk about these differences for a long time, but just hang out with the guy named Jim Mooney, and he's probably making stuff up too, but no, he actually really knows this stuff. He's one of our best local resources for gulls. And what he says, you actually believe. You'd like look at in your book and like, oh, you were right. That is a glaucous winged gull or something like that. Anyway.
We have a question about
Sure.
gulls.
I'm not taking questions on gulls. Next.
Are there any locational clues? Do either venture far from shorelines?
Yes, that's an excellent question. So usually when in the summertime we'll get inland, we'll get both ring-billed and herring gulls. But for whatever reason, in the wintertime, most of the ring-billed gulls will head towards the lakefront. So inland, you're going to get many more herring gulls. I think I have that right. Somebody will tell me if I've got that mixed up. But that's an excellent question. And that's the case too. It's a good reminder of location is an important one. Particularly if you're near like saltwater, freshwater coasts, that's even a bigger, help, I guess. But for even on Lake Michigan, you'll get different birds in the river, which is only a mile away from the lake. And, just because of those habitat preferences. So, moving on, greater versus lesser scaup. Okay, moving on again. Any Ampidanax flycatcher. So this is a bird that even if we have these birds in our hand at bird banding, we still can't identify them. So you can look at your field guide all you want, unless you hear them sing their song, and their songs are different, and that's great. Unless you see them, hear them, you just can't. You can't. You can try, So one of these is a least, one of these is a yellow-bellied, one of these is a willow, one of these is a maple, one of these is I don't know. They're all different, and it's not even worth like pointing things out now, because you'll never get, even if you do get looks like this, chances are. But again, if you start to get addicted and you're ready to make that move, you can certainly try. But I guess this is a good point to my earlier point about how field marks here are useless, almost completely useless. But this is where you can start to look for behavior. I mean, obviously song is the best, but this is where you can start to look for little behavior changes. Again, not much, and timing. Timing of the year. So the first and last are the least flycatchers. They're the most commonly, and those are the ones that I'm good at identifying, because you hear them, they do a little chibik, and when you hear that, they're one of the few that actually will come to our parks and sing for you. So willow and alder, by the way, are so difficult to tell apart that even if you have them in your hand, you can't accurately tell them apart in bird banding. So we actually, they used to be grouped together, and they were called the trails flycatcher. But recent, systematics, they got separated into species, and unless you hear them or what the habitat they're breeding in, that'd be another good clue. If you have them in your hand, you have to call them trails. You can't identify them. So it just, again, this is, I could look up a lot of facts and then spew them, and then we'd all probably forget them tomorrow. But it's Ampidanax flycatcher. So there is a grouping, of course, on eBird that is the Ampidanax flycatcher. And so you can say that it's one of these birds. And the buzz. Oh, and then I'll throw in a peewee too, just to make things easier for you. Yeah. So if you see any of these, peewee isn't an Ampidanax, but if you hear it, it's got one of the sweetest little calls that says its name. Peewee. Okay. So if you thought the Ampidanaxes were hard, look at the Starling. Okay, now try to tell it apart from this peewee, and try to tell it apart from this red-tailed hawk. So hard. Meadowlark, killdeer. Oh my gosh! Like, how can you even tell them apart? This is where I'm going to try to. This is why I did the sound here. I'm going to play a little ditty here for you. That's not it. Okay, so if you have your volume up, you might want to be prepared to turn it down, because sometimes if I play this, it'll kind of startle you with its loudness. But I'm going to go ahead now that I've given you the warning and play this little snippet.
This is BirdNote. As you step outside in late fall for a breath of fresh air, the searing cry of a red-tailed hawk pierces the air. The distinctive scream is coming from a tree nearby, but when we scan the tree for the bulky form of a large hawk, we see only a small black bird. It tips its head back, opens its bill, and we've been fooled. It's a starling giving voice to the hawk's cry. In fact, the European starling, the continent's most abundant non-native bird, is an accomplished mimic. Starlings are especially astute imitators of bird sounds that have a whistled feel, like this sound of a killdeer. And this quail. European starlings regularly incorporate both into bouts of singing. They can duplicate a car alarm or a phone ring, too. What adaptive benefit might starlings gain from copying the sounds of other birds? A leading view argues that by mimicking, a male starling adds to its song repertoire, making him just that much more attractive to the females than the next male on the branch. So, the next time you hear a red tail scream, double-check its author, especially if there are starlings nearby. For BirdNote, I'm Michael Stein.
Okay, I'm assuming you guys heard that because nobody told me you didn't hear that, so hopefully that went well. But yeah, this is one of the most commonly misidentified, particularly on places like eBird, is that they'll get birds that they shouldn't have yet, and so, you know, the most common one for me is I hear a killdeer, and it's a starling, but they've certainly been fooled. I thought it was a meadowlark, turned out to be a starling. So blue jays are also pretty good mimics. Blue jays can mimic a couple kinds of hawks, red-tailed hawks and red-shouldered hawks, and broadwing hawks too. And I could have done the same slide 8 with the mockingbird, of course, but also the gray catbird or the brown thrasher, which are all excellent mimics. And I've been absolutely fooled by a gray catbird that's been in Washington Park. And I don't remember what the bird that we thought it was, but I think we were just about to, we were going to mark it on our list, and then it flew out and we saw that it was a catbird. So so mimics can also make identification hard, and that's when eBird will flag, like, are you really sure you saw a meadowlark, because it's way early, or a killdeer, because like they haven't even reached this other part of the world yet, and you're saying you heard one. So that's where, like, when Ethan tells you about writing good notes, might be worth saying, well, I didn't see it and I heard it, and then that, well, maybe it was a starling. Obviously, if you see the bird, that's a different thing. Next, we've got, man, I always say this is going to be shorter, but it always ends up being just as long here. Red-breasted versus common mergansers. The females, the males are pretty easy to identify, and you can look those up in your field guides of choice. Particularly that the male red-breasted has a red breast, go figure. But the females can be a little bit harder, and these pictures make it a little bit easier than you normally would think. Anyway, so the common merganser on the left has a nice clear delineation between the red on its head and the white on its neck. And again, that's not always easy to see. And then you also look for that little white patch underneath the eye. This again is a very detailed and easy to see distinction, but it's definitely not always the case in the field. And then the red-breasted on the right, it's much more of a blurry line. In this case, it kind of all looks like the same color, that kind of reddish grayish pattern. But you know, they're about the same size, and it's hard to tell them apart otherwise. But that's something you want to kind of double check. And if they're hanging out with males, if there's a pair, sometimes the best way to identify a duck is if they're in pairs, if it's a breeding season and they're in pairs, the males tend to be a little bit easier to key out. Okay, chipping and tree sparrows aren't that hard, but you do have to be careful, and they're often misidentified in eBird. They don't sound the same, but they fill a very similar niche, often high in the trees, and well, that's not entirely true because a lot of times we'll see tree sparrows on the ground. But the reddish head, again, if you look at this, you think, well, that's not that hard to tell apart. But again, you don't always get the really good look at them. If you can see any kind of smudge on the chest and the breast, that's a tree sparrow, whereas a chipping sparrow is going to have a really white breast. So it's probably more likely if you're gonna call a chipping sparrow, which the chipping sparrows are here in the summer and the tree sparrows are here in the winter. There's a little bit of overlap, but the tree sparrows kind of come and go with the juncos, which are also winter birds. And the junco sounds an awful lot like a chipping sparrow. So you do have to be a little bit careful if you're just hearing chipping sparrow and it's either early or late in the season. It could be a junco, but it's kind of nice to throw in some birds that are a little bit easier to identify, but also to be a little bit more careful. And then to our question early on, this is again where if you keep track of eBird and you know kind of when birds are supposed to arrive, palm warblers like the one in the upper right and pine warblers in the upper left tend to be one of the earlier warblers. And we don't really associate them with the yellow warbler on the bottom, but sometimes the yellow, and you don't really see it in these photographs, but sometimes that yellow can be super, super bright. And a lot of times, I was talking to the eBird coordinator, a lot of times people will mistakenly say that yellow warblers that a palm or a pine is a yellow, even though it's way earlier than they should be here. Because again, palms and pines are one of the early ones. So it's just good to double check and make sure you kind of know what you're looking for between the yellow, the palm, and the pine. And that's it.